you have more sort of understanding of what people's lives are like. Is that why do you think that is? Is that to do with your upbringing? I mean,
I think it's the mental health thing, Lucy, really.
yeah.
Is that when I was 32, I had Matty, my firstborn. And before that, I had, I used to use the word depressed like we all do. I'm depressed, because I didn't get that job. I'm depressed because it's raining. I'm depressed because I can't afford to go on holiday. We use that word very flippantly. And I'm not sensitive about people using it that way. It's just one of those things. But I was plunged into a very, very serious postnatal depression after Matthew and was hospitalized. I was on the verge of a puerperal psychosis, as it turned out.
Yeah.
And with most people, or a lot of people, and I always want to say this in case there's pregnant people or people starting a family listening to this, in most cases, people who have even severe postnatal depression can go on to make a complete recovery. Sadly, with me, I didn't. I went on to suffer from major depressive disorder episodes, breakdowns from most of my life. Ironically, through all of this time, I have been very overwhelmed. I've been very with my husband. Let's do the podcast. I've been very overwhelmed. I've been very sad. I've been incredibly emotional, but I haven't actually had an episode of depression since 2019. I know when mental health issues tip, there is controllable anxiety that therapy can help with, that fresh air can help with, that exercise can help with talking to your loved ones and having support, thanks darling, can help with. And then it tips over into mental illness. And that's when you can't come back from it, or you will always suffer from that. And I think I am aware of how that can happen, not just to the people in the tower block. It can happen. It's like when I read an article and it says, successful barrister Susie Snodgrass, the mother of beautiful twins and a handsome husband with millions in the bank, walks into the sea of Whitley Bay Beach and commits suicide, takes her own life. And then you get that is just so selfish. Do you know how ill that woman must have been to do that? Depression, major depressive illness, clinical depression, doesn't care whether you're a millionaireess or whether you're a pauper. That's why I was one of the most vocal supporters of Meghan Markle. Did she tell a porky about that she hadn't Googled Harry before? Yeah, but loads of people do that. Paul McCartney believed that Heather Mills didn't know what the Beatles were. Everybody tries that. My point was, if she had postnatal depression and felt that she had to put on a painted smile, I know what that's like. And that's why I would maybe have more compassion for someone like Meghan Markle than other people would, to have gone through the hatred and the vitriol that girl has been through in 2 years, and having given birth to 2 children and being vulnerable to postnatal depression. I'm with her all the way.
So do you think that informed your thinking around the lockdown restrictions and how we handled the pandemic?
Totally.
So not every country did it. We had Sweden and other countries which allowed people, to make more choice about it. But talk to me about what you feel the
whole lockdown thing. Again, this is where it verges into sort of the political side, and I don't profess to know much about that. But all I do remember is that when China had locked down the Wuhan sort of the province of that included that area, I remember Tedros Adhanom from the World Health Organization. I remember him saying how successful China's lockdown had been. And it's like, well, they're still in lockdown. So how can you say it's been successful? Hang on a minute. I don't understand how you're saying it's successful. And I'm shouting into the ether and people are going, Tedros who? China who? It's like, oh my God, why am I so obsessed with this? Why? I didn't understand, because everyone else had just gone into their little ostrich thing, including my, members of my family and that. And I don't read the news. It just jumped out at me. And it's like, well, lockdown was, I'd also read a lot of the pandemic document of, I think, 2011. So, I knew that all these different Labour politicians, Tory politicians were shouting at each other. It's like, hang on a minute, you all signed it. Lockdown was never on the cards. You know, the reason the Tories kept the borders open, Labour, you would have kept the borders open because that's what it said, because you were all treating it as a flu pandemic, which this wasn't. So don't you be shouting now saying you should have shut the borders. You know, this is me to my Labour people. You know, you would have done the same, mate, because that's what it said in the pandemic document.
Yeah.
And so lockdown was never, ever a thing. That was all a Neil Ferguson and his independent sage thing.
Yeah.
Who I think of, you know, anyway. So
well, we're still in a state of emergency now. We're still treating it as an emergency,
but I mean, I don't think it is an emergency right now.
How do you define emergency? I think that's the question. But
also, the other thing is, Lucy, is that it's almost like the pandemic is not going to go away in as much as we are not going to eradicate COVID. Pretty much most people have said that.
Yeah.
So apart from the few zero COVID zealots, but, you know, it just hasn't worked and it won't. So we almost as a nation have to decide when it's over, because it's like, do you think people aren't dying of AIDS? They're dying in their millions of AIDS. We have a vaccine for tuberculosis. 3 million people worldwide die of tuberculosis. 1,000 children under the age of 5 die every year from flu worldwide. No, 1 million children die every year from flu under the age of 5. Okay, so what is a pandemic? Those things are still going on. We just had to get to a point where they became livable with, so that the other 67 million people can go back to living some kind of life, and we look after ourselves. You know, again, the other thing is, I had so many functional doctors get in touch with me, you know, people who look at the more holistic side of life. Not once did we ever get those messages of look after yourself. Not once did we, you know, apart from when Boris had his, you know, near-death experience or whatever with COVID and, you know, got on a running machine for 2 minutes and all of that, you know, malarkey posturing. But, you know, we then start doing, I mean, it's like abroad, Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's, and you have to show your vaccine passport. It's like, do you look at what you're doing? Look at what you're doing. You know, I am an ambassador for Lighter Life. You know, the reason that Lighter Life changes lives is because they use cognitive behavioral therapy to change your relationship with food. We know that if you just go on a diet, we all know how to diet. You know, you don't eat as much, you lose weight, but you haven't learned the skills. It's like when you give up alcohol, you haven't learned the tools to change your relationship. We don't help people with obesity in this country. We fat shame a lot of the time. And, you know, those people have got massive emotional issues. And of course, I had a driver brought me back from Birmingham last night for this theatre job that I stood in for at the last minute. The one I said was terrifying. And he told me how he was about 13 stone. He'd gone up to 18 stone in the pandemic because of fear, because of sitting at home, because of anxiety. And he stopped exercising, and he just ate and ate and ate and ate. And of course, we know that the most danger of not just COVID, of anything, of type 2 diabetes, is obesity.
Yeah.
But we've
got a quarter of kids now obese. That's risen during the pandemic, and that's our children. So what are we setting them up for? Yeah.
What are we setting them up for?
Yeah.
But, you know, and some of the commentators who are going on about, well, I would line the unvaccinated up and never let them go anywhere and lock them in their homes. And it's like, well, you know, you are also a real health hazard to yourself, and you want to be looking at yourself because you would also be putting strain on the NHS. So where does that stop? You know,
I mean, viral load is similar in vaccinated and unvaccinated.
Yeah.
It's not a sterilizing immunity. So to think that we're not in a pandemic of the unvaccinated. But no. I mean, looking at Europe and what's happening in Germany and Austria, you know, how do you see 2022 for Europe and for your industry? You know, what are your thoughts and fears?
Well, the thing is, it's like there was a caption yesterday that I saw, and it's like a cartoon caption, and it's one woman, and she's saying, "I comply because I want this to be over," and the other woman says, "It's because you comply that this will never be over." And the problem is with my profession is that if we listen, I'm not saying that we should, you know, I'm not condoning, but it's like we have to stop just taking everything that its governments say as fact, because we will never get out of it. Because the thing is, what happens is that, you know, say in the theatre, is that if this fear continues, shows will start panicking so much about they will start cancelling everything. My agent said that TV projects that were green lit are now amber.
Well, because
so
of the new variant.
All of her phone calls are, when am I getting the dates for that series? She said it's on hold.
Really? So
this is an industry that is thousands of people. We're not just talking about the poor star who won't be able to perform in the play. We're talking about the thousands of people that work and rely on that job for pay. And when theatre came back, when I first went to the theatre after lockdown, it was the most joyous eruption of applause, and people were crying just to be back in a room, cheek by jowl with people. You know, the whole socially distanced thing, it doesn't work, Lucy. Theatre's about sitting cheek by jowl with people, sharing and standing and shouting, you know. And
in our DNA to be social.
It's in our DNA. And if you take those things away from people, we just slowly curl up and die.
Yeah.
And I will fight for my last breath. You know, who am I? You know, two-bit actress, D-lister this. I don't give a shit what they say about me. If I'm helping a few people a day to realise that they're not alone in their thoughts, then my job is done.
So tell me about, do you know people that have spent their savings, and do you know people that have had no work for ages, and do you know people who may be, you know, facing rent arrears or problems in your industry?
Oh my God. Absolutely, people who've never recovered. And also the thing is, there are several people who, you know, a lot of the people I know are theatre performers. You know, they don't have a television career. They're hugely talented theatre performers or musical theatre performers. But of course, all of next year, theatre-wise, is cast, because that's all stuff that was happening in 2019. So they're in a queue of, can I have some work? Well, not next year, because that's all cast and done, you know? And then there were the actors who were getting a job in Sainsbury's, for example, and then they'd get an audition, but they couldn't take the time to go to the audition because then they'd lose their job at Sainsbury's and nobody could get a job to pay the rent. These jobs were like gold dust, you know, really? Last year. It was awful. There's a company manager that I know, and he doesn't have a lot of money. He'd lost all of his jobs. And yet he was sending 50 quid a week to this wardrobe mistress that he knew, and he'd waited 6 weeks for universal credit, and he didn't have to piss in, you know, and yet he was sending handouts to a wardrobe mistress who didn't have anything, who had children to feed. And
the government would say that they put in furlough and they put in this money and that money to support people, and they didn't let them go. But you feel that there were lots of people who fell through the net. Yes.
Tell people to look up Excluded OK. Just takes a Google. Just talk to some people there about the people who had not one solitary penny.
And so, because they're freelance, and so they weren't in any system. So what's the situation like now for people in your industry? What's it
well,
like?
Obviously it has hugely improved, because we were told that we were going to have to live with COVID. So gradually restrictions, as we know, have been lifted. Yeah. And the masks because again, the mask thing is very controversial. I get that. But there is nothing like either being in an audience without a mask. And bearing in mind, Lucy, when I went to the theatre, when I said that, you know, there were 500 people in there. Why do you have to be told nobody had a mask on? Why, if it's so life-saving and so important to these zealot people, why do you have to be told by the government to wear one? Why weren't you wearing one just because you were wearing one? You know, I just don't get that. And I think it's wonderful to either be in the audience just enjoying it, or to be on stage and looking out. I hate being on stage looking out to a sea of masks, because you can't see people. It's the children being masked I can't bear. And people go, you know, It's only a mask. It's not only a mask. Children learn, develop because of what they're seeing. And if masks work, why are you cancelling all the nativity plays? Tell the parents to wear a mask. If they work, why are you cancelling everything? Sorry, I get in a right. I think it'll be going, calm down, this is.
No, but you speak good sense. I suppose the argument that people have is that they work just a little bit, and if you can save one life, but it's all about, measuring
But
harm.
how long does it go on for? If that's the case, are we wearing them forever? Because as we know, COVID isn't going away. So are we wearing them forever then? Is that just what we say? That we will be a mask-wearing society forever? Because it's not going away. There will always be a new variant. I'd rather take my chances. And this is somebody who has just seen my dad die of a respiratory infection, of pneumonia. My dad was never offered a pneumonia vaccine. Why is it just COVID that has to be highlighted above every other, above every other thing?
One thing I want to go back to, just the last sort of years before his death. I do want to, because I want to talk about your dad quite a bit, if you don't mind. But he was a very sociable man. He loved acting. He was your coach. So did the lockdown impact on him and his mental health? And do you feel that people's lives, their short, this period before their death was kind of not worth all the suffering?
I absolutely, totally and utterly. My dad was an incredible guy in his spirit. He was, if my dad suffered mentally over everything, we never knew about it. He was always an optimist. Lincoln and I gave up alcohol, as many people know, 10 years ago. So we became Mr. and Mrs. Boring. We love it. We love being boring. We love doing very little and staying home, watching stuff. And my dad was, one day in my dad's life, just hearing about it, we were exhausted. He was so social. You just have to look at the outpouring for him on social media. It was like my dad was the famous one. It was just incredible. So many people loved him. And I think to go through 84 years and never having anybody said, I don't like you, is really quite something. And I take strength from that. But in that last year, when I mentioned before about dad saying, like a little boy, can I go here and there and everything, even though he saw my sister and I saw my dad's spirit go. And I saw it in his eyes. But it was only when he died and we were going through a few things, and we found these poems, a couple of poems that he'd written about the lockdown. And he'd never shown us them. And he wasn't really he didn't write poetry or anything, but we saw these poems that he'd written about how it had spoilt things. And was it ever gonna come back? Human contact and human connection and fundamental rights of seeing people. And it was very sad to read, because he obviously had these thoughts that he didn't really, talk about very much. And I think that, for those people who didn't slightly break the law about seeing their parents, I think those people are struggling now. And I think that's where they're pushing back at people like me, because they don't want to accept that they didn't see their mum for a year, or they didn't see their dad for a year, that they actually did stay away from their parents for a year and didn't see them. And if I'd done that was the last year my dad was well. And if I hadn't seen him, I'd never forgive myself, and it will never ever happen to me or anybody I love again, ever.
No. That's really powerful. I'm kind of halted. You're so articulate and you cover it so well. I'm just sort of, I've run out of questions, which is really rare for me.
Well, to be honest, I think I feel like I've had therapy.
Well, no, you're amazing. No, but it's inarguable. I'm meant to be adversarial, and I'm meant to saying, but what about this? And what about? But you can't argue with you, and the arbitrary way that rules are put in. It's just, I can't. There's nothing to say. But is there anything? I'm just looking at my questions here.
I don't think so, Lucy. I really appreciate you listening to me and giving me the opportunity to to say how I feel, and I think you'll agree that I'm not trying to be a medical person. I don't know everything about it. It's how I see it, and as I say, this is all comes from looking after the mental health of us, even if it's a handful of people.
Well, and that is something. You are a patron of a mental health charity, aren't you?
I'm a patron of SANE, the mental health charity, and I am a patron of Mind also.
So from your work with them, do you see, because I know that we've been told suicides have not significantly gone up. Do you feel that people...
I completely and utterly dispute that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And also, it's not just successful suicides, it's the attempted suicides. Living whilst wanting your life to end, because most people, when they take their own life, Lucy, they don't want to die, they want the pain to end. And there are people living wanting to die, but they won't take that step because of their family or whatever. And so they are living a living torture, a living death. So it's not just about the statistics of who actually succeeds in taking their life. It's how many people are living wanting to.
And you feel quite strongly that lockdowns have impacted on people in a way that may have tipped them.
I think that lockdowns are not I think that lockdowns have caused more deaths than they have saved, ultimately in the long term,
suffering. And as you mentioned before, we've got 1.5 more children with
1.5 million children not being able to access mental health, and that will impact them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and so that's a huge problem. So in other words,
our next generation, you know?
Yeah, and we need to treat them. So we use of resources, I think it was 100 billion was Operation Moonshot, and resources could be spent differently. And if we've got a generation coming up who have lost education and have mental health.
37 billion, track and trace. That was a huge success, wasn't it?